In August 1905, a Swiss farm labourer named Jean Lamfray committed one of the most consequential crimes in the history of alcohol. In a drunken rage, he murdered his pregnant wife and his 2 young daughters. The country was horrified, and it wanted an explanation. And the explanation the newspapers, the prosecutors, and eventually the government settled on was a drink. Lamfray had drunk absinthe that day, 2 glasses of it. What received far less attention was everything else he had poured into himself before breakfast and after. Something like 7 glasses of wine, 6 of brandy, a coffee laced with more brandy, and a couple of crèmes de menthe. And that was more or less an ordinary day for him. He was, by any reasonable reading, a catastrophic alcoholic. But it was the 2 glasses of absinthe that went on trial. Within 3 years, Switzerland had written a ban into its constitution. Within a decade, the drink was outlawed across most of Europe and the United States, and it stayed illegal for the better part of a century. And here is the thing. The science that justified all of it was wrong. Modern chemists have gone back, found sealed bottles from before the ban, and tested them. And the terrifying compound that supposedly drove a generation insane turns out to have been present in quantities far too small to do anything at all. That sounds insane. But the fact that the Western world banned an entire drink for 100 years on the strength of a myth, a moral panic, and a wine lobby that wanted its customers back tells you something. Absinthe was never just a drink. It never was. So what actually was the Green Fairy? Why did the most fashionable drink in Paris become the most feared substance in Europe? Did it really make anybody hallucinate? And if not, where on earth did that idea come from? To understand it, you have to start with the bitter little plant that humans have been arguing about for 3,000 years. Absinthe is built on wormwood, and specifically on the species Artemisia absinthium, sometimes called grand wormwood. It is a silvery, aromatic, ferociously bitter herb, and it has been in the human medicine cabinet for as long as we have written anything down. The ancient Greeks called it absinthion, and Greek and Roman physicians prescribed it for digestion, for fevers, for parasites. It is the plant that gives its name to vermouth, by way of the German Wormwood. It even turns up in the Book of Revelation, where a star called Wormwood falls from heaven and turns 1/3 of the waters bitter, which is either a spectacular coincidence or the best piece of foreshadowing in literary history. For most of that time, wormwood was medicine, not pleasure, because it tastes genuinely awful. The trick that created absinthe was working out how to make it delicious. Sometime in the 1790s, in the Val de Travers, a green valley in the Swiss Jura mountains near the French border, somebody did exactly that. They took wormwood and married it to anise and fennel, whose sweet, licorice-like intensity tamed the bitterness completely and distilled the lot into high-proof spirit. Those 3 botanicals, wormwood, anise and fennel, are still called the Holy Trinity of absinthe, and a spirit that leaves any of them out is, to a purist, not really absinthe at all. Who that somebody was is genuinely disputed, and the popular story is probably too neat. The version everyone repeats is that a French doctor named Pierre Ordinaire, who had fled to Switzerland after the Revolution, invented the elixir and dispensed it to his patients as a cure-all. It is a lovely tale, and the man existed, but the Swiss version of events is less romantic and more likely that the recipe belonged to local women herbalists, the Henriod sisters of Cuvée, who were already making and selling it, and that Ordinaire either learned it from them or is simply a convenient male doctor that history preferred to credit. Either way, in 1797, a lace merchant called Major Daniel Henri Dubayed bought the recipe, spotted the commercial potential immediately, and went into production with his family the following year. His son-in-law was a distiller named Henry Louis, who tidied up his surname to something snappier and, in 1805, opened his own distillery just across the border in the French town of Pontarlier. The surname was Pernod. Pontarlier would eventually hold 28 absinthe distilleries and become the world capital of the drink. Absinthe might have stayed a regional Franco-Swiss curiosity, except that France went to war in North Africa. Through the 1840s, French troops campaigning in Algeria were issued absinthe, on the reasoning of the day that wormwood fought fever, and that a slug of strong spirit made dubious water safer to drink. Whether it did much good is doubtful. What it certainly did was give an entire generation of French soldiers a taste for it. They came home carrying that taste, and absinthe arrived in the cafés of France with a whiff of military glamour attached, the drink of men who had been somewhere and seen something. What had been a Swiss country tonic became, almost overnight, fashionable, patriotic, and modern. And then came the accident of history that turned a fashionable aperitif into a national habit, an insect. In the 1860s, the vine louse Phylloxera arrived from America and began devouring French vineyards, and over the following decades it destroyed the overwhelming majority of them. Wine became scarce and expensive. Brandy, which is distilled wine, became scarcer still. And absinthe, which was made from grain or beet alcohol and needed no grapes at all, was suddenly the cheapest, most abundant, most reliable drink in France. An entire nation of wine drinkers, temporarily deprived of wine, switched to the green stuff, and never entirely switched back. Remember that, because when the vineyards eventually recovered, the wine industry looked at what had happened to its market and did not find it funny at all. By the last decades of the 19th century, absinthe was not merely popular in France. It was a national institution with its own hour of the day. 5 o'clock was l'heure verte, the green hour, when the cafés of Paris filled up and the whole city seemed to turn the same colour. And it came with a ritual so elaborate and so beautiful that it is really the drink's greatest invention. You did not simply pour absinthe and drink it. You poured a measure into a glass, laid a flat, perforated silver spoon across the rim, set a sugar cube on the spoon, and then dripped iced water over it, slowly, sometimes from an elaborate multi-tapped fountain in the middle of the table, until the sugar dissolved and the water was several times the volume of the spirit. And as the water fell in, the drink performed its trick. Clear green liquid turned cloudy, opalescent, milky, blooming into a shifting pearl-coloured haze. The French called it the louche. It is not magic, it is simple chemistry. The essential oils of the anise and fennel dropping out of solution as the alcohol is suddenly diluted, no longer able to stay dissolved and scattering the light into that milky glow. But watching it happen, slowly, at a cafe table at dusk, made drinking absinthe feel less like ordering a drink, and more like performing a small ceremony. The ritual was half the appeal, and it is a large part of why the drink still fascinates people today. And the scale of it is hard to overstate. By the early 1900s, France was drinking absinthe by the tens of millions of litres a year. It had begun as a respectable bourgeois aperitif, the thing a gentleman had before dinner, but as the price fell, it swept downward through society until it was the drink of clerks, labourers, students, and the destitute alike. Cafés advertised it on their awnings. Poster artists produced some of the most beautiful advertising of the age for it, all swirling green and Art Nouveau lettering. There were absinthe spoons made as souvenirs, absinthe fountains as café furniture, and an entire visual language built around a single bottle. For perhaps 40 years, absinthe was not a drink France enjoyed. It was a thing France did, together at the same time every afternoon. If you are finding this video interesting, hit subscribe. We dig into the hidden histories behind drinks every week, and you will not want to miss what is coming next. Absinthe also attached itself permanently to art. The list of drinkers reads like a roll call of the era. The poets Verlaine and Rimbaud, the painters Manet, Degas, Toulouse-Lautrec, and Van Gogh, and later Oscar Wilde, Picasso, and Hemingway. Degas painted a bleak, brilliant picture of two figures slumped over a glass in a cafe, and when it was shown in London it caused an outright scandal, denounced as a disgusting warning about the state of French society. Toulouse-Lautrec reportedly carried the stuff around in a hollowed-out walking stick. Wilde left behind a famous line about how the first glass shows you the world as you wish it were, the second as it is not, and the third as it truly is, which he called the most horrible thing of all. Out of all this grew the most durable myth in the history of drink, that absinthe was a hallucinogen, a chemical muse, a substance that opened doors in the mind and let genius or madness come through. It is an intoxicating idea. Painters of visions and poets of derangement drank it, so surely it must have caused the visions. Van Gogh drank absinthe and cut off part of his ear, so surely the drink did it. The Green Fairy was not a nickname for the colour. She became a literal presiding spirit, a muse who visited you in the glass. The truth about those artists is sadder and more ordinary. Many of them were simply alcoholics, drinking everything they could get, and several struggled with mental illness that had nothing to do with Wormwood. Van Gogh very likely lived with a serious psychiatric condition and drank heavily of everything, not just absinthe. The drink did not grant him his visions or his torment, he brought both to the café himself. But a genius with a glass of something exotic and green in front of him makes a far better story than a sick man with an addiction, and the better story is the one that stuck. It was nonsense, and we now know it was nonsense, but it took 100 years to prove. The pseudoscience arrived courtesy of a French psychiatrist named Valentine Magnan, who was convinced absinthe was uniquely dangerous and set out to demonstrate it. His experiments are the origin of everything that followed. He exposed animals to wormwood oil, essence of wormwood in concentrated form, and observed them convulse. In one celebrated demonstration, a dog given wormwood oil was said to have gone berserk and barked at a wall for half an hour. From this he concluded that absinthe caused a distinct disease, different from ordinary drunkenness, which he named absinthism, complete with its own catalogue of symptoms: hallucinations, seizures, madness, moral collapse. The error at the heart of that work is enormous and, once pointed out, obvious. Magnan was not testing absinthe, he was testing concentrated wormwood oil, which does contain a compound called thiou-jone, and which in that concentrated form genuinely can cause seizures. But the amount of thiou-jone that survives distillation into a bottle of absinthe is a tiny fraction of that. Blaming absinthe for the effects of neat wormwood oil is like blaming an apple for cyanide because you can extract it from the pips. Nevertheless, absinthism entered the medical literature as a real diagnosis, and the public learned, as an established fact, that wormwood drove men mad. It is worth pausing on how convenient that conclusion was for everyone except the drinker. A doctor got a career-defining discovery, a brand new disease with his fingerprints on it. Society got a tidy villain for its rising tide of drunkenness, poverty and crime. A single green bottle to blame rather than the harder truths of industrial misery and cheap strong alcohol everywhere. And nobody had to ask why so many people were drinking themselves to death in the first place. Absinthism explained the wreckage without implicating anything uncomfortable. That is exactly the kind of idea a society reaches for when it wants a problem to be simple. Meanwhile, the drink itself was changing in ways that made the panic easier to believe. Early absinthe had been a bourgeois pleasure, well made and expensive. As demand exploded, cheap industrial versions flooded the market, and unscrupulous producers cut corners horribly, using crude alcohol and, to fake the appearance of the good stuff, adding actual poisons, copper salts to get that alluring green, and antimony compounds to make the drink louche convincingly when water hit it. So some people drinking cheap absinthe genuinely were being poisoned. Just not by the wormwood, and underneath all of it sat the simplest explanation of all, the one nobody wanted to say out loud. Absinthe was commonly bottled somewhere between 45 and 74% alcohol. It was ferociously strong, it was cheap, and France was drinking oceans of it. The symptoms of absinthism, the tremors, the hallucinations, the seizures, the ruined lives, are the symptoms of catastrophic alcoholism. The country had a drinking problem and decided it had a wormwood problem. Two powerful groups were delighted to help it believe that. The first was the temperance movement, which was gathering force across Europe and America, and which found absinthe the perfect villain. Foreign-sounding, lurid, green, associated with bohemians and artists and the urban poor. The second was the wine industry, which had clawed its way back from phylloxera to find that its old customers had spent 30 years learning to drink something else. Attacking absinthe was, for the winemakers, straightforwardly good business, and they attacked it hard, funding campaigns that painted the green drink as a poison, destroying the French race, while wine naturally was wholesome and patriotic. Then Jean Lanfray killed his family, and the campaign got its martyrs. A petition in Switzerland gathered tens of thousands of signatures. Switzerland banned absinthe by constitutional amendment, effective in 1910. The Netherlands had already gone. The United States banned it in 1912. And France, the drink's spiritual home and by then consuming it by the tens of millions of litres a year, banned it in 1915, in the anxious early months of the First World War, when a government worried about the fitness of its soldiers was in no mood to defend a bohemian aperitif. Notably, Britain never banned it at all, and neither did Spain, which is a large part of why the tradition survived anywhere at all, and so absinthe vanished and stayed vanished for the better part of a century. The distilleries closed or converted, most famously to making anise liqueurs without the wormwood, which is exactly what the pastis in French cafés today descends from. The drink survived only as a rumour and a piece of forbidden glamour, the thing that had driven Van Gogh mad, whispered about by people who had never tasted it. The vindication, when it finally came from a laboratory. In the 2000s, an international team of chemists, including a New Orleans-born scientist named Ted Brough, who had become obsessed with reverse engineering the real thing, tracked down sealed, authentic bottles of absinthe made before the ban and analysed what was actually inside them. The results, published in 2008, ended the argument. The Thujone content of pre-ban absinthe was essentially the same as that of modern absinthe, far, far too low to cause hallucinations, seizures, or anything else beyond what the alcohol itself would do. A separate review of the historical medical evidence concluded, in its title, that absinthism had been a fictitious 19th century syndrome. The compound that got a drink banned across the Western world had never been present in a meaningful dose. The Green Fairy had been framed. There is something almost poignant about how that vindication happened. For a century, absinthe had no defenders with laboratories. It had only its reputation, and its reputation was ruin. The people who could have tested it had no legal product to test and no reason to bother. It took obsessives, collectors of dusty pre-ban bottles and distillers determined to resurrect the real recipe, to finally put the myth under a mass spectrometer. The answer they got was not subtle or ambiguous. The old absinthe and the new absinthe were, chemically, essentially the same drink, and neither one could make you hallucinate. 100 years of exile rested on a measurement nobody had taken until somebody finally cared enough to take it. By then the legal walls were already crumbling. Absinthe crept back into Britain in the 1990s, exploiting the fact that it had never actually been illegal there. Then across the rest of Europe, under new regulations capping the Joan at levels the real stuff comfortably met anyway. The United States allowed it back in 2007. France, extraordinarily, did not fully repeal its own ban until 2011, 96 years after imposing it, and even then only after years of pressure from producers and enthusiasts. There is one last myth worth killing, because you will see it in bars constantly. The dramatic ritual where absinthe is poured over a sugar cube, set alight and allowed to flame before being doused. That is not traditional, not French, and not historic. It was essentially invented in the 1990s, popularised alongside some fairly rough Czech products, and it does nothing for the drink except burn off the alcohol and scorch the delicate botanicals the distiller worked hard to preserve. The real ritual is the old one. Cold water dripped slowly, over sugar, no fire anywhere near it. If you ever see someone set your absinthe alight, they are performing a piece of 1990s marketing, not the Belle Epoque, and quietly wrecking the drink while they do it. Today, absinthe is legal nearly everywhere, made properly again by distillers in Switzerland, France and beyond, some of them working from recipes recovered from those very pre-ban bottles. It will never again be what it was, a national habit with its own hour on the clock. It is a specialist's drink now, and a beautiful one, but its real legacy is not in the glass. It is the cautionary tale that a society looking for a simple explanation for a complicated problem found a green bottle, that flawed experiments hardened into settled fact, that commercial interests were happy to fund the panic, and that it took 100 years in a chemistry lab to say, quietly, that everyone had been wrong. So the next time you watch cold water fall into a glass of absinthe and see it bloom from clear green into that shifting, pearly cloud, that theatrical, ordinary, harmless thing, remember what it actually carries. It carries a bitter herb the Greeks prescribed and Revelation named. It carries Swiss women herbalists who probably invented it and mostly did not get the credit. It carries French soldiers in Algeria, a plague of insects that emptied the vineyards and filled the cafés, and the green hour in Paris when a whole city drank at once. It carries poets and painters and a myth about a muse that was never true. It carries a psychiatrist torturing animals with the wrong substance, a wine industry that wanted its customers back, and a man in Switzerland who drank everything in the house and let one bottle take the blame. And it carries 100 years of exile, ended by somebody finally bothering to open an old bottle and measure what was inside. The most demonized drink in history, banned across the world for a crime it did not commit, is sitting in your glass right now, clouding gently, utterly ordinary, waiting to be noticed. Absinthe was never just a drink. It never was, and it never will be, no matter how quietly it clouds in the glass. If this story surprised you, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories behind drinks. We have got a lot more coming.